So if you're considering getting an R5 or R6 or even an EOS R, because this camera still pack a punch in 2020, in this video I want to help you pick up your first RF glass or one of the best prime lenses that you can get for your money. Also, we're going to talk about zoom lenses. So all that information coming right up. Welcome back to the channel, guys. Gaston right here, and if you're new to the channel, I do gear reviews, tutorials behind the scene. So if you like the content around the channel, consider subscribing and also enable notifications to be notified every time my content goes up. So we're gonna start talking about this lens that I have right here, and as you guys have seen, this is the 35mm f1.8 image stabilized macro lens. Now, why did I decide to put this lens as the first lens? Well, there's several reasons. When I first got the EOS R, I didn't want to spend a lot of money on glass because I wasn't sure if I was going to like the system. So I decided to go with a 35mm for several reasons. Now, first of all, 35mm as a prime is a very versatile focal length. The second thing was that this was the cheapest lens, was $449 at the time when I got this lens. I think that right now it's going for about $500. And the third reason why I like this lens was because, well, number one was image stabilized. The EOS R doesn't have image stabilization, and number 4, it was one of the lightest lenses that I could actually hold on. So this lens right here was more like, let me try and see how it goes. Happens that after shooting with this lens, I fell in love with this lens for several reasons. Reason number one, the optics on this lens are incredible. I'm pretty surprised that this lens is not more expensive than $449 when I got the lens. But the quality that you get out of this lens is way better out of the quality of any 35mm f1.8 that I have tried. I also own the Sony version of the 35mm f1.8, and this lens by far is way better than the Sony in many, many ways. Now, also, I tried this lens in video, and like I mentioned before, this lens is image stabilized. Now, if you're gonna be getting an R5 or R6, you're gonna be able to pair the stabilization of both cameras, 5.5 stops, with the stabilization of the lens getting up to 8 stops of image stabilization. So for this reason alone, this lens is a no-brainer and it's not going to disappoint you. Now, one of the features that you're gonna find on the lens is image stabilization on and off, and also you're gonna have an autofocus and manual focus switch, and it ends right there. Now, the next lens on the list is this one that I have right here, and this one is the 50mm f1.2. Now, this one belongs to the L glass series, so what I mean is basically it's the utmost quality of glass that Canon can offer, much more like the G Master from Sony. Now, when I started shooting with this lens, I became addicted to this lens. And one of the reasons why I like this lens so much is because of the versatility of the 50mm. Most of the work I do is actually portraits and product photography, so this lens suits me really, really good. Now, if you're a photographer that is not so much into wider type of shots, maybe this one may be your first lens to get as a prime lens. And the only problem that this lens is a little bit pricey. You can actually check the price right here. But thankfully, Canon is announcing a new lens that is supposed to come out pretty soon, which is the 50mm f1.8. Now, the advantage of that lens is that that one is image stabilized. This one is not. Also, the new lens is going to have macro capabilities, and this one doesn't. I mean, you can get pretty close with this lens, but the other one is going to have macro capabilities, and it's going to be less expensive than this glass. So the difference between both glasses are going to be probably this one is an L glass, the other one is not. However, comparing the quality from this lens and my 35mm that I just showed you before, to be honest with you, it's really hard to tell the difference. So I don't think you're gonna get a less of a lens for going with the less expensive option of the 50mm. Now, I own this lens, I love this lens. It's a little bit bigger than most 50mm that I own from Sony, for example, but I mean, it's a really great type of lens. Now, the quality coming out of this lens is amazing. You know, the bokeh out of this lens is super dreamy. This one may be a good option for the EOS R5 and the EOS R6 if you want to shoot in video. Now, with the R, I don't have image stabilization. The lens doesn't have it, so I haven't been shooting video with this lens, but I can't imagine using this lens with the R5 or R6, you know, now that they have embodied image stabilization and really dialing this thing at f1.2 for the super shallow depth of field. So if you have the funds, you're not gonna regret this lens, and this is a lens that you're gonna keep for many, many years to come. So yeah, 50mm f1.2. And this one is going to be the next lens on the list that we're gonna be talking about, and it is by far my best portrait lens. And we're talking about the 85mm f1.2, a lens that is pretty chunky, girthy, and also has a pretty lens hood. Look at this. It's pretty big when you put it together. Now, this lens is actually outstanding. It also belongs to the L series type of lenses. The overall performance of this lens is just nothing but the best. The focusing system, it features the USM technology, just like the 50mm. So when it comes to focusing, even an f1.2, this lens is super snappy and actually pretty accurate. Now, I can't imagine using this lens with the R5 and R6 because those two cameras are gonna have the dual autofocus version 2, so this lens is going to be a dream. Now, one of the disadvantages of this lens right now is, well, number one is the price, but number two is that these lenses are now image stabilized, just like the 50mm. They don't have embodied image stabilization, and probably that would have made the lens even heavier. But with the R5 and R6, you're gonna be able to use these lenses now for video, handheld, no problem. And I mentioned video handheld because the lens is kind of like big and heavy, and probably for most standard gimbals, this one is gonna be a very front heavy lens. So, but again, there is another option if you're into 85mm, which is the 85mm f2 with macro capabilities. This lens is actually ready right now for pre-orders. I pre-ordered it. It's much smaller. It looks a little bit bigger than the 35mm, to be honest with you. So it is a lot smaller than this lens. I'm assuming that it's going to be a lot lighter than this lens, and it's also going to be image stabilized. So not only the lens is going to be cheaper, but it's going to have more features than this very expensive lens that I have right here. So I'm excited for the lens because when it comes to traveling, I try not to travel with heavy lenses. I always go with one backpack and I rent everything else that I may need at the location. But again, if you really want a dedicated portrait lens, and if you really want the fastest lens that Canon has right now for the RF mount, this one is the lens to get, and you're not gonna be disappointed. Now, next up, we're gonna talk about zoom lenses. And the very first zoom lens that I wanna talk about, because it's one of the lenses that I use the most, is this one that I have right here, which is the 15 to 35mm f2.8. Now, there's a lot of reasons why I love this lens, and there's a lot of reasons why you should actually check out this lens. Now, disclaimer, this lens is not the cheapest lens out there, but it features a bunch of stuff. Now, the number one thing that you're gonna find in this lens is that this lens is a 15 to 35mm, not a 16 to 35mm. So it's a little bit wider than most lenses out there from this range. Now, the other advantage of this lens is that this lens has image stabilization. Now, one of the reasons why I got this lens is because I used to cover a lot of events, you know, before COVID-19. I do a lot of conventions. So now this lens is actually the perfect lens to actually vlog and flip the camera if you need to capture some of the surroundings. You know, you're gonna be able to do that 15 to 35mm. Now, the next reason why I love this lens is because the EOS R doesn't have image stabilization, and the image stabilization in this lens makes my footage very, very usable. Now, remember, with the R5 and R6, once again, you're gonna be able to pair both image stabilization, getting up to a stop of image stabilization. Now, let's talk about the quality of this lens. When it comes to quality of this lens, once again, this lens features the ring, the red ring, which is also an L series lens. So the quality of this lens is super, super sharp, you know, all the way, all across the frame, to be honest with you. The lens is actually very manageable. It's not that heavy. It's not the cheapest lens again, but I mean, none of the L glass series are actually cheap, but it is a glass that is not going to disappoint you. Now, if you're into the wider realm of lenses, I mean, this is the lens to get. Now, another reason why you may want to get this lens, if you really want to get one lens for most wider needs rather than getting the 35mm f1.8, you can actually get this one. Yes, you're gonna lose stop of lights, but again, the depth of field that you get from this lens is actually pretty amazing. And you know, you have that advantage that it's a slightly better glass than the 35mm. Other than that, I mean, I cannot recommend this lens enough because it's just outstanding, and I'm actually in love with this lens. It lives in this camera. Now, the following lens that we're gonna talk about is probably the very first zoom lens that you have to buy, or that you should buy if you're a professional series photographer. We are talking about the 24mm to 70 f2.8. Once again, L series glass, and this lens is by far the best 24 to 70mm that I ever tried from Canon, Nikon, and even Sony, and Sigma. So this glass is outstanding, guys, and it features incredible stuff like image stabilization. Another reason why I use this lens a lot, because the EOS R doesn't have embodied image stabilization, and once again, R5, R6, you're gonna be able to pair that image stabilization with the one on the lens. Now, like I mentioned before, you know, this lens features pretty much the same. You have the configurable ring, and this is something all across all the Canon RF glass, and the super smooth ring. You have the image stabilization on and off, autofocus and manual focus switch, and it ends right here for this lens. Now, the size of the lens and the weight is pretty similar to the 15 to 35mm. Actually, let me show you. So as you can see, they're fairly similar. The only thing that this one has a lens hood that is a little bit deeper than the 15 to 35 millimeters, but other than that, they're pretty similar, so you're gonna kind of like have to count with the same space if you want to bring both lenses. This one could be the only lens for a while for a lot of photographers. You know, you're gonna be able to shoot wide at 24 millimeters, you're gonna have telephoto capabilities at 7 millimeters, and you're gonna have a fast aperture of 2.8. The other added bonus is that this lens has image stabilization, so if you're designing to get an EOS R, this is a great option to get, guys. Now, if you want something even cheaper or something with a little bit more of reach, you can get the 24 millimeter to 105, and they make it in two apertures, the f4 and I believe f4.5 to 7.1. So now a lot of options when it comes to the 24 to 105 millimeter type of reach. Now, if you want the best lens for your money, this one is going to be the one to get because it's going to allow you to shoot in lower light situations. And I mean, I just love this glass. So let's talk about the best lens that I think I've seen in the past maybe 5 years. And it happens to be this one right here. We are talking about the 70 millimeter to 200 f2.8. And once again, this lens is an L glass lens. Look how short this lens is, and actually let me compare it to the 24 to 70 right now. All right, so compare the difference between the 24 to 70 millimeters and the 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8. This is one of the reasons why I love this lens so much. This lens is so easy to carry. Now, this lens actually packs incredible image stabilization features. You have 3 modes, and the image stabilization in this lens is really good, especially for the EOS R. So you have mode number 1 basically enables all the axes of image stabilization. Mode number 2 is going to disable the horizontal axis, so it's going to be great for actually panning across. And the third mode actually enables the image stabilization when you release the shutter. So basically take the picture, release the finger, and it enables the image stabilization on all axes. So I use this lens a lot, and I always travel with this lens since I got it because it's so light to travel. Now, the other thing that I want to show you guys is the comparison between this lens with the Sony version. So this is the Sony version, and as you guys can see, it's a lot shorter. Also a lot lighter because this lens is made out of magnesium, where this lens is made out of some sort of plastic. Now, the fact that these lenses feature a plastic construction doesn't mean that they feel cheap. As a matter of fact, to me right now, it's actually an added bonus when you actually want to stack up a bunch of lenses in your backpack and bring them with you. You're gonna appreciate the lack of weight of these lenses. Now, another feature that we have in this lens is actually the zoom lock switch right here. So, you know, if you are afraid that the lens is going to extend, then you lock it. But as a matter of fact, it just doesn't do it pretty often. So I love this lens, guys. So this lens is going to be great for event photographers, wedding photographers, sport photography, and even portraiture. This is the reason why I've been using this lens so much, because it gives me that 200 millimeter reach, which it creates a lot of background compression. And again, the bokeh that you get out of this lens at a 2.8 is actually incredible. So it's gonna be fast, it's gonna be great for low light situations. And it's a lens that is not the cheapest, but I think it's well worth its money. Now, there's no other option as of right now for this lens. And the other added bonus is that you can get this lens and then get one of the teleconverters that right now Canon announced, the X1.4 and the X2.0. So you can actually convert this lens up to a 400 millimeters without having to spend the money on another lens. Now, the only problem with teleconverters is that you lose one stop of light. Now, when it comes to picking up your very first prime lens or zoom lens for the RF system, it's going to be a tough call, guys, because as a matter of fact, any glass that you're going to get today from the RF, or at least the ones that I tried, are really good in quality. Now, remember, when I got my very first lens ever was the 35 millimeter f1.8, and that was a $450 lens, which is the reason why I got the lens. So don't get fooled by the price of the lens. You know, I think you're gonna have to keep in mind 2 things. Number 1, where you're gonna be trying to use the lens for, and number 2, what is your budget? So if I would have to pick a lens right now, probably the first prime lens that I would get is the 50 millimeter f1.2, because I do mostly portraits and I really like that super fast aperture. Now, if you're someone that is actually more into video or hybrid shoot a lot, maybe the 50 millimeter f1.8 macro image stabilized, which is the up and coming lens, that is going to be a better lens to get, because you're going to be able to use the image stabilization from the R5 in tandem with this new lens. So other than that, you know, you could actually pick up whatever lens that you can afford, and you know that you're gonna be covered and you're gonna get great quality. So when it comes to your first zoom lens, at least in my opinion, I think the 24 to 70 millimeter is going to be the best option for you. This is it for today, guys. If you have any questions regarding these lenses, make sure to drop your comments down below, or if you want me to do a video specific to a lens, also suggest us in the comment down below, guys. I hope I helped you. And if you like the content around here, consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this one. And until then, guys, in the next video.